This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 294th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm not one of those writers who is so admirably dedicated that they take their writing with them on vacation. I've tried it in the past, but about the only time I'm not too distracted to write is in the car, and even assuming I have a driver, I usually get carsick after about 20 minutes of that. So I've pretty much just given up on it. So, having just returned from a week away from my writing, it can always be a little dicey jumping back into a story. I haven't been actively thinking about it for a good chunk of the time. Fortunately, the segue back into full-blown writing mode went super smooth this time. I credit that mostly to the fact that the writing was going really well before I left, and I was just getting to a big and fun scene. Great when it works out that way. The latest post in the video series on my blog is Discover the Simple Trick for Creating Vivid Story Descriptions. It offers a super easy rule of thumb for always finding the best and most evocative details for your story descriptions. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Just Because Your Protagonist is Reactive doesn't mean he's passive. Discover the difference. One of the stickiest questions any writer is likely to face is, what's the difference between a reactive protagonist and a passive protagonist? If you've been studying story structure with me, then you know I talk a lot about how your protagonist needs to be reactive in the first half of the book. But this idea causes a lot of writers to scratch their heads, because isn't it true that you're also told, like all the time, that your protagonist should never be passive? Isn't reactive kind of like passive? And if so, doesn't that mean that this passive/reactive protagonist is likely to sink the first half of your book, good story structure or no good story structure? Good questions, all. So let's examine the differences between the reactive protagonist, yay, and the passive protagonist, boo. The first half of your story is all about your protagonist being off balance. The first plot point at the end of the first act forces him out of his normal world and into the adventure world of the second act. From there, he's going to spend the next quarter of the story, right up until the midpoint, reacting to everything that has just happened to him. So what does this mean? It means that the reactive protagonist is off balance. I like to visualize the first plot point as something that comes along and physically smacks the protagonist. It literally knocks him off balance. Some first plot points might fling him completely off his feet, others might only make him trip, but he's shaken up. He's scrambling to not just regain his feet, but to figure out what just hit him. He's reacting. He's not the one who did the hitting, he's the one who got hit. And now, he has to compensate in some way. The reactive protagonist is not in control of the conflict. This is probably the most important thing to understand about the reactive protagonist. His reactivity is almost solely the result of the fact that he is not the one who is controlling the conflict. The antagonistic force is firmly in control at this point. Stuff is happening to the protagonist and he can't stop it. He can't even properly combat it because his balance is compromised. To add to our visual image, it's like he's being pelted with rocks while he's still trying to get back to his feet after that mighty whomp at the first plot point. The reactive protagonist is not in possession of a complete understanding of the conflict and the antagonistic force. This one is also crucial. Not only is the protagonist not in control of the conflict, but he doesn't even fully comprehend the conflict. He may not understand what's happening to him at all, or even how it might be possible such as Vicus's transformation in Neil Blomkamp's District 9. At the least, he doesn't understand why the antagonist is getting in his way, or what the antagonist's motives may be. And he most definitely doesn't yet understand enough about the conflict to know what the antagonist's next move might be. The reactive protagonist is not in possession of a complete understanding of himself and his own motives. Particularly if your protagonist is following a change arc, he's also going to be struggling to understand a lot of his own motives at this point in the story. He's in the grip of the lie, and his blindness about himself, just as much as any other factor, is causing him to get smacked around during this part of the story. The reactive protagonist isn't passive. You saw that one coming. Just because a protagonist is reacting doesn't mean he's passive. More on that in a sec. The reactive protagonist isn't goalless. This is key. Your protagonist may be reacting, he may not be in control of the conflict, he may not fully understand what's going on, but he still wants something. He has a goal and he's moving toward it, or at least protecting his ability to move toward it later. In Steve Miner's Forever Young, protagonist Danny McCormick is in a totally reactive position when he wakes up after being frozen for 50 years. But he always has the very clear goal of finding his friend and figuring out what happened to him. The reactive protagonist isn't stupid. We sometimes equate passivity with stupidity. We see this dopey character who's been knocked off his feet and is now being pelted with rocks, and he's just sitting there, taking it. Well, if that's what your character is doing, then he is passive, and he is pretty stupid. But a reactive character is doing something. He's trying to regain his feet. He's trying to shield himself from the rocks. And even if he's not being too successful at it yet, that's most definitely not stupid. The reactive protagonist isn't defeated. Passivity is also often equated with defeat, and rightfully so. That dopey character who's just sitting there taking a beating would only be doing that if he's already given up. But if your character is reacting, he's not passive, and he's definitely not defeated. Just by exploring what a good reactive character is and isn't, we already have a pretty decent idea of what a passive character must be. In his book Story, Robert McKee writes, "The truly passive protagonist is a regrettably common mistake. A story cannot be told about a protagonist who doesn't want anything, who cannot make decisions, whose actions affect no change at any level. The passive protagonist is one who either has no goal or is making no effort to achieve that goal. If your character spends most of his time staring out the window or observing as other people do things, that's a good sign he's lapsed into passivity. Always ask yourself, what does my protagonist want in the overall story? What does he want in this scene? What is he doing to try to achieve it? If the answer to any of those is nothing, then you know he's not reactive, he's passive. So say goodbye to passive protagonists and let them start reacting instead. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.